already? Whatever. I mean, I don't even know. What does readiness mean in a when it's homebrew? Some years ago, I was involved in filming for a documentary called Grief Walker that I appeared in. And we filmed it up and down this river here, just in front of the house. And then we shot some material in Nova Scotia. And I met out there a Mi'kmaq artist named Alan Sillaboy. And I hope he's still with us. I haven't heard of him or from him for a long time. But we had some interesting sit down, Al and I did, those days. And this was in the 80s, I believe. So this recession was prominent. And this subject came up, recession. And he said, you have a recession? That's the way he put it. You have a recession? I said, personally, I haven't really, not personally, but that's what they say, yeah. And he's, because I had a hospital job at the time, so I guess I was doing okay. And he said, man, you'd have to tell us if there's a recession, he said, because it's no different for us in a recession than without a recession. It's kind of the same life here on the res. I hadn't thought about that until these epic flu days, when we're here on the farm, and most of us haven't been. I certainly haven't been off the farm for, well, with one exception, for feels like a month and a half, or something like this, and yet, with all the isolation that we're obliged to respect, nothing's any different. Which tells me what kind of an isolated existence I typically do. I'm practicing this social isolation thing without even knowing it for years now. So as are you. And of course, if I'm practicing social isolation, anybody who might be watching, all 17 of them, wondering who's laughing and all of that. And the truth is that we're on a farm and we're working the farm together over the years, and we've found a protocol that respects the health concerns of the day and doesn't flaunt anything. So we're taking care of it, and so far, so good. But for all of that, it's a strange observation that in a time of where people are really chafing over being obliged to sit tight, nothing's changed for us. At least that's the way it seems to me. And I'm very grateful that but also arrested by the idea that my normal life represents social isolation at its best. So I don't know if this contributes to my capacities when I go out on the road or not, or have to compensate for it. But we thought, we sat down a couple of weeks ago together and wondered aloud about things. The format is a kind of question and answer thing, but the truth is that we're both just wondering, and people responded to it and asked if there's anything else, and maybe to try again. And things have happened since, and other things haven't, and so we thought we would go ahead and wonder out loud about the times. Well, I don't really know what we're going to wonder about, because I'm on the receiving end of what you've prepared, and lucky to be. So why don't we go ahead, and anybody who has something they want to wonder about, and I'll see if I can wonder back. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I was speaking on the phone the other day with a man who's in his early 40s, and his life in the last couple months has been in a bit of an upheaval. And as he was speaking about this, he was saying, well, it's mostly old people that are getting this disease and dying from it. So really, what's the big deal? What's the big deal if a few old people die? And I was struck by this, wondering, well, who do you have in your life, or who don't you have in your life, that you could say such a thing so honestly? And I don't think he's alone in thinking this. I don't imagine that he's the only one thinking these things.
Yeah.
And I was trying to come to terms with, well, what happened that could be thoughts in a younger person's mind, that they could, at worst, hate older people, and at best for him at least, it was a complete indifference to their existence or not. And I was wondering, as a man of achieved age, what you would say to someone who thinks these things or has this indifference or hatred towards older people.
Likely than not, I wouldn't say anything to them, to be honest. Because, well, I'm not a missionary, and I'm certainly not a missionary on behalf of decrepitude or the swoon of the last third of your life or anything of the kind. But what would I say somehow in response to this? Well, in no particular order. The first thing is going into this epidemic. The warning pattern was everybody's equally susceptible, particularly people with predisposition, which includes me. But by and large, it seemed like we were all fair game. And then as the weeks have gone by, it's clear that that's not the case, right? And so, and everybody knows at this point that in Canada, certainly, it's an enormously high number of people who've died, not only older, but older in older folks' homes, so-called continuing care facilities, right? Why? Let me start there. Why, you don't have to be an epidemiologist to know why. Why this virus is enjoying its maximum sway in those places. It's because we have old folks' homes. That's the reason. If we didn't have old folks' homes, we wouldn't be talking about it in this way, right? So the first thing to come to grips with is what kind of an indictment this particular flu has become for our way of life. It's an extraordinary revelator now, I think. And it's showing us when you segregate older people for the sake of maintaining your middle-aged status and job scenarios and all of the things that are I think the typical reason why there are all old folks' homes, because we can't care for so-and-so at home. But the measure of I can't care for so-and-so at home is what? It's not that you're probably not physically able, it's that you're deeply disinclined. And the disinclination usually is attributed to your work schedule or the kids or whatever it is, that it just doesn't work. As if them in an old folks' home works. Well, it appeared to have worked until this virus. And now the virus is saying, is this what you mean by worked?
Wow.
Right? So there's the first thing. The second thing is it's not surprising at all what this person has said to me. When I was out on the road with Come of Age, one of the things that really was very striking is how many people said to me, it wasn't until I was listening to what you're talking about here that I realized beyond my blood kin, I don't know any older people, period. See them occasionally, but they remain anonymous and peripheral, and I don't know any. And then they stopped and said, come to think of it, I'm not sure I know many young people either, as it happens. So So this is to say that, I made the case in that book that we don't have generations anymore. We still use the word, but generation arbitrarily was 30 or 35, something like years long, but nobody's got the time to have a generation that's that long. Nobody's got a time to be associated with somebody 30 years their junior and imagine themselves to be in the same generation, inhabiting the same scale of concern and speaking the same language and amenable one to the other. So I suggested there we have decades, not generations anymore. So you're allotted a decade. That means 5 years on either side of you. Those are the people you tend to know, hang around with, associate with, feel some kind of kinship with, that kind of thing. And the comment comes from there, doesn't it? It comes from the idea that, of course, older people are spent, basically done. And as such, without much to contribute and heavily on the take, in terms of the national purse and so forth, it begins to raise the question, what are they for? Right? The criteria by which older people become irrelevant is a kind of middle-aged person's productivity. Right? So you can imagine then somebody who says this without saying so is living in an extraordinary degree of fear and dread at the prospect of getting older.
Whoa.
Right? So when middle-aged people are carrying this kind of prejudice about age, one of the things it is inadvertently is a confession that, like that song comes from my teenage years. I hope I die before I get old. And you can tell if somebody says that, that's what they're counting on. Counting on meaning hoping for. Yeah. My mother was one of those. She courted physical mayhem by smoking. And when I challenged her about it, her line constantly was, you got to die of something. And she certainly did, emphysema, as it happened. But you don't have to, as Leonard Cohen said gorgeously towards the end of his life, you don't have to cooperate so enthusiastically with the process. Excuse me. So, ultimately, if we're going to mourn anything that comes out of that comment, I would mourn what's become of a way of life in the most affluent culture that probably the world has ever seen, whereby someone is so remarkably isolated from the gravitational pull of age that they wish it away as a solution to their own loneliness. I think you can't be more lonely than to know nobody older than you. That might be a certain kind of loneliness that we've got the patent on. I had heard when I was writing Come of Age, somebody said it was a curse from Georgia, the first Georgia, the original one. I think it went something like this: would that your last elder dies before you realize the depth of your loneliness. Yo, that's an extraordinary curse. Because you can hear the understanding of the balm, which is age. Right? That when you're experiencing all kinds of existential loneliness through the beginning and intermediate parts of your life, the presence of agedness has some consequence for that solitude, that despair. And minus them, your despair is complete. And you can hear it in that.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Sadly, but truly. So, interestingly enough, a good response to the comment is not to consider really what's become of age in our time, but rather what's become of everybody who's not aged as a consequence of what's become of age. So the principal consequences I think, of the diminishment of agedness don't accrue to the aged. The principal dilemmas are middle-aged and younger.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Tell them to hold on.
Wow.
And if the virus doesn't get him, tell him to hold on until he joins the ranks of
Wow.
the bent over. And then he might get a second chance to think about it.
Wow.
Whoa.
Right?
Wow.
And he can't compensate for the darkness of his comment, obviously,
Uh-huh.
but he could behave as if there's another generation of younger people with a similar disposition to the one that he had.
Wow.
And he might have some consequence in their lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you, Stephen.
Mm.
I'll remember your words and help him to remember them should we make it to old age.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you too.
Mm-hmm. I've been reading your book, your beautiful book, which you've mentioned a few times now, Come of Age.
Yeah.
And I came across a small quote in the chapter entitled The First Ancestor.
Uh-huh.
The context in which you said this is important. So it's you're reimagining and in every way deepening the cultural understanding of ancestry to go beyond our very simplistic DNA understanding to include what grants not only us but anybody their health could be the origins perhaps even of their ancestry. And you make a small but very troubling observation, or actually it's a question where you ask, is Big Pharma becoming our ancestor?
Right.
And I'm wondering about that in the context of this new medical authority that's now the paragon of apparently truth, as so many of these mandates are coming down to us from on high. Whereas a few months ago, or many months ago, these were public health agencies that were underfunded and the likes, and now they've become perhaps more trusted than even our elected officials. And I'm wondering if you think this constitutes the making of a new religion, or the undermining or even a new understanding of our humanity from whether it's vaccine companies, public health officials, or this apparently scientific community who is reorganizing our choices and daily lives, essentially.
Wow. Well, let's start with the quote, as best I can remember it. The idea is that it's the understanding of health that animated that. Wasn't that you're in optimal performance mode, right? Health was that which enabled you to participate in the health making of people around you. Yeah, so it wasn't like a personal possession. Right? It was, somehow you could almost imagine as a kind of emanation. So your health is a consequence of the adversity that your circumstances entrust you with, right?
Wow.
I mean, we know this at the base level of infection and people intuitively know that the more protected they are, the more vulnerable they are. The more safety they seek, the less safe they're likely to be.
Wow.
Right? This kind of strange irony that nobody anticipates. That when you set yourself up for a project of obtaining for yourself a degree of safety that allows you to perform adequately, in the marketplace of ideas or in the workplace or in the relationship business, you discover to your tremendous dismay your total inability to contend. Right? 'Cause so safety's disabling. That's the point, right? So then you understand that your capacities are born in an experience of incapacity. They're born in the circumstances by which you are brought to your knees, figuratively, medically, emotionally, and otherwise. And I'm not talking about character building. I mean the stuff that nobody sees coming, that you could have known but didn't know. And I mean, nobody goes looking for this kind of stuff, but the good news is it comes anyway, right? So left to your own devices, you will care for the stuff that seems to benefit you. And the good news is that life, not being overly impressed with your choices you make for yourself, will provide for you the kind of antibody development regime called hard times, right? So that's what I meant by health in that. It's coming back to me now. Yeah. So your health is a consequence, as I said, of the adversity that you wouldn't seek. So it's a very counterintuitive thing, right? Okay. So the recourse to big pharma, I mean, I'm not sure that was a cheap shot on my part, but let's say it was. Let's say I could have been more inclusive, because it's not just a big pharma, guys, right? It's the willingness to resort to big pharma. This is the kernel of your question. That might be the bigger dilemma. In other words, if there were a big pharma, but nobody was overly impressed, it wouldn't be big for long. Right? It'd be little pharma. Something like the homeopathic business, maybe. And then I don't know what would happen. Would we fetishize homeopathy and turn it into big? I don't know. Well, it seems to be the case that we need to have somebody who's going to rescue us, and then somebody who asks us to cope, right? And the rescuer always gets more attention from the consumer than the one who's pleading with you to engage, right? So big pharma now is probably the shadow player in what's happening. I'm not a conspiracy guy, and I'm not really impressed with the thinking, though I understand the appeal of it, right? But I don't go for it. So, but it wouldn't surprise me that big pharma's capacity to position itself to benefit, I mean, let's face it, where do the profits come from? If everybody's doing okay, they're not. Now, that's not a conspiracy. That's just the clearest rendering of the circumstance that you can possibly make. Now we have a global pandemic where, as it's happening, you don't have extraordinary levels of disabling infection after all. You have a degree of lethality that's quite subtle compared to the expectations. And yet the hankering is not after developing antibodies by exposure. Nobody wants to be exposed to this thing. I don't pretend to know the science of it. And maybe this is an exception, that you don't actually develop health by exposure to this. I don't know. But let's imagine that it's not an exception, that rule applies. And we're being encouraged to keep away from each other, and in so doing, to limit our exposure. And if we're doing that, are we not at the same time limiting our capacity to develop some kind of health in the face of this thing? Right? It seems to follow that that's exactly what's happening. And our recourse is in the direction of what? Of vaccine, not of exposure. There. So who's in the vaccine business? Is it the governments? No. The government's not in the vaccine business. They're barely in the regulatory business over the vaccine development. Right? That's the truth. So now who stands to benefit most intensely from the notion that everybody has to get inoculated. I mean, a lot of parents are contending with, as you will, soon enough contending with, do you inoculate your kids? What do you do before they go to school? What are the laws in your part of the world regarding, booster shots and all this kind of thing? Will this be gathered into that? Will this be the one that eclipses all the other ones, that stills for all time the disturbance around submitting you and yours to this? Maybe. And if all of that plays itself out in the next 12 to 16 months, and I'm fairly sure it will, could it stand to reason then that whoever produces the vaccine will play a more fundamental role in adjudicating your sense of whether life is trustworthy or not?
Whoa.
A more fundamental role in your life in that regard than any governmental body, any elected official, any religious or spiritual guide, which I think is the... I've never thought about the consequences of the quote and applied it to the circumstance until you just asked me to do it now. It's an amazing question. And it's an alarming question because it seems that big pharma is very loath to self-regulate. If there were ever an industry built on if you can, you should, that would be the one.
Wow.
Right? And the rush to market for the inoculation is going to be, I mean, you can imagine they must be working 80 hours a day, putting their scientists through it, right?
Wow.
Yeah, just to get there first. And it'd be the gold mine that nobody could even have dreamt of. Well, I guess the big boys dreamt of it.
Wow.
So nobody was, at that level, at the board level in big pharma, nobody was surprised by this. And do I attribute some kind of dark, nefarious instinct to them? I just remember this. I worked in the death trade for quite a while. And in that time, and there's no heroism in this, I was pleading with the powers that be in the hospital to respond differently to what was going on, to the death phobia and grief illiteracy of the times. And the resistance was quite elaborate and quite profound. Here's a wrinkle. Every time on the caseload, a doctor came up, a dying doctor came up, nobody wanted that case. Because, quote, and I remember them saying this, everybody knows how doctors die. Argumentatively, belligerently, deeply uncooperatively, and so on. So they took them, but they weren't really wild about it, which says this is doctors thinking about dying doctors.
Wow.
See?
Wow.
And I tried to make the case with them that when you're dying, you're not a doctor. Whatever you think you know, and whatever role it plays, and however you second guess the treatment that being afforded to you, and all the rest, the truth is you won't die as a physician, right?
Wow.
And so this was my plea to get people to respond differently now, and if not for you, then for your loved ones, none of whom will be in a position of superior intelligence and moral authority that we attribute to the physicians now. I'd say the same thing to all the people working in pharmaceuticals. When you're dying, no matter what it's of or when, you won't be dying as a beneficiary of what you're involved in right now. Right? You may be dying, though, as a consequence, inadvertently, of what you're participating in right now. I mean, it's really, it's a real grim challenge to make, but the parallel seems observable to me,
Wow.
Yeah. Good question.
Beautiful. Thank you. Good answer. Good response. Beautiful response.
Thank you. Well, the original question I had, you've already answered it.
Gee, it happens.
In your, yeah.
That happens.
In the beauty of the afternoon so far.
Mm.
But I have also been thinking of hospitality as I've been in town a few times and being able to meet people outside and that being offered a tea, for example, outside and having this great, well, not accepting because their hands are touching and wondering about guest and host and in these,
I'm like that outside of these times myself. So what are you wondering about it?
I was wondering partly, is there something old to remember of what it is to be a guest and a host that we've forgotten in the way that guest and host has been in maybe the recent my memory, or is there something that hospitality deserves in these times when we're asked not to be in each other's company, or in a way that's recognizable?
Mm-hmm. Are you asking me something about what the etiquette might be of a plague?
Yes.
Yeah? What etiquette descends from the advent of a plague?
Wow.
Yes.
Okay, the answer, the observable answer is none necessarily. Except and I'm not sure this is etiquette, but it's every person for themselves,
Wow.
right? and the view that anyone else is potentially a lethal visitation. So that's been there. It's probably softening this many weeks into it. But certainly at the beginning, I'm sure people were inclined to make great distance, even to avoid, even to run from other people. I haven't had the experience because I've been here. So, but what might the etiquette be that a plague gives us an opportunity to observe? You know, I wish I could give you the word, but ancient Greece, in the time of Homer in particular, had a number of very technical words for various grades and distinctions of hospitality. Clearly, it was very important to them. You can always track the importance that any culture attributes to a given thing by the elaboration of their vocabulary around it, right? Yeah. So they had a particular word for the kind of hospitality you exercised with people that you knew, that you were related to either by blood kinship or by ongoing familiarity, daily or weekly encounters. They had a different word and a different kind of hospitality for people you didn't know. So it wasn't, as soon as you didn't know the people, then hospitality ceases and it's a different order. No, they had another word.
Wow.
And they recognized it as a different kind of hospitality that the advent of the stranger asked of them. And a subset of both of these, they had a particular technical word for the end of the hospitality. Because their vision was that any hospitality that didn't explicitly end was unkind and began to undo all the hospitality that had been enacted prior.
Wow.
You see, it just the old idea of, fish and house guests. After 3 days, they both begin to smell. Apparently. So. People have asked me quite a bit in interviews in the last month or so about my the die-wise related things. A lot of people referring to the book or just reading it now. A lot of the interviewers very, very compelled. Their take on it is that this plague is a visitation of our dilemmas around mortality and so on. And my response across the board has been, that's not what it is at all. I don't believe that people are encountering their mortality as a consequence of, so many public service announcements and government thises and all that sort of thing. I think what they're experiencing is deep disaffection with being asked to self-regulate and to limit. Of all things, it's a very minor keyed level of disturbance, right? Yeah. So this is my way of saying that if the plague was really a visitation of our mortality, then we would have the following possibility arise. You're going to die of something sometime. That's what a vision of mortality means, right? So then is your project to whatever you do, don't die of this now? Is that it? I'm not saying this is a pleasant way to die. I don't know that many pleasant ways to die. That sedation doesn't enable. And I'm not sure that's pleasant either.
Right.
But the utility of a plague is that it creates arbitrarily in the culture, among those who are willing to think the thought, the idea that this is a given now. It's not negotiable. It's not debatable. Your mortality is clear and present. You are accompanied by it. What then must your etiquette response be to the presence of your own death? Which was not probably in the question as you imagine it, but it's there. You can hear it now, right? So I've said that in different circumstances than this, that your death is a God, is a deity, is a God, right? Not like a God and not from God, but your death is a deity. And as such, certainly bigger than you in every way, means things that you can't mean and all the rest. I won't go into great detail about it now. But as such, if you have a deity in the room with you, I don't know how many postmodern hipsters have a sense of how to conduct themselves, right? But let's imagine that there is such a thing, that you do have options, and that the presence of a deity asks you to go deep quickly, right? Without a lot of hedging your bets and yeah buts, to wonder if this deity is not hostile to you, and it's clear that your death is not hostile to you. No. But your death is also not to be thrown off the scent of you, even though you prefer that, right? What you're left with is the idea that your death is to be cared for because you're not in its house, it's in your house. Doesn't mean you're in charge. Just like when you're providing hospitality, you're not actually in charge, right? You have the keys to the cupboard, but you're not in charge of whether you should open it or not. The presence of the guest means that the cupboard has to be opened.
Wow.
It's amazing, no? Yeah. Yeah. So the plague is a visitation of this scenario, it seems to me. COVID-19 is a god, right? And it doesn't really mean you any harm. It's just doing the only thing it knows how to do, right? Came into the world to proliferate. And it's giving us a run for our money because we're in the proliferation business like nobody's business, right? And the virus is looking at us saying, oh, really? You mean like this?
Wow.
No limits, right? So the beautiful thing about hospitality is that it has limits in time, right? I was asked the last few times I've been interviewed about this, people not being able to say goodbye to their relatives dying of the plague because of the isolation and so on. Is there any particular anything that I would have to say to them? And my response was not to fetishize the moment of death, but to understand that if the understanding of dying is present with you, then you get a chance to interact with it without having to wait for the moment of last gasps.
Wow.
You don't need that. It doesn't make it truer when the gasping begins, right? It's. I mean, we're all sitting here in relative health, thankfully, and it's true for us now,
Wow.
right? So I'm reminded of what the Dalai Lama said when he was challenged about his orientation to the Chinese years ago, given what was happening in Tibet. And he said, when I think of them, I think, my friend, the enemy.
Wow.
It's an amazingly articulate rendering. No segregation, no apartheid, but a clear willingness to see things for what they were. He wasn't saying, my friend, the friend, right? My secret, real friend, because this adversity brings out the best of me thing. No, it's the karmic wheel grinding away, isn't it? Yeah. So we could think of this plague in a similar fashion. My friend, the enemy. Friend in the sense that its presence creates opportunities that our ordinary life utterly dispelled.
Wow.
The ability to take things seriously together, like in concert together. That's an amazing thought. That it took something like this to enable us to inhabit the same place at the same time without a matter of opinion. And I'm not sure, for the moment at least, that all the rancorous language around personal identity and identity politics and sexual orientation, all of that stuff has for the moment survived the radiation of the plague.
Wow.
I'm not saying it's gone. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But I'm just saying it doesn't seem to be occupying center stage the way it did just a few months ago. Right? And there's some mercy in that, because we get to see what we were so willing to line up with and to weigh in on and to exercise our grievance with. We get to see it in its proper light, which is that it's not everything. It's far from everything. Right? And there's something about the possibility of somebody very close to you dying of this. That urgency exercises something in you that you could call etiquette.
Wow.
Right? How do you conduct yourself as if people around you could die from this? If you pass through the veil of the mania and you begin to look at people as if they could be gone soon, something changes. And then eventually you realize it's not as if they could be gone soon. In a reasonable time frame, we'll all die soon. Right? Okay. Once this veil is rent and you see that, what does hospitality look like now? It might be the most devotional, spiritual enterprise available to us. So, the plague is a God inviting us to learn again what it means to be human. Maybe. Oh, I think it's there, whether we learn that or not. I mean, there's not that many humans interested in learning about humanity, as it happens. So,
Wow.
That's beautiful.
thank you. Thank you too. Yeah. Madame.
You were just speaking about learning, and that's somewhere where my question is coming from. I've been noticing in the last month at least, or it was actually brought to my attention, I can't take credit for it, that when a beloved 2.5-year-old asks me a question to which I'm going to say yes, I say absolutely.
Mhm.
And I wondered about that.
Yeah.
It really had me pause.
Mhm.
What does absolutely mean? And I
Yeah.
look it up, and it's free of uncertainty,
Yeah.
no doubts.
It's rid of
It's
uncertainty.
completely without limits.
Yeah.
It's perfect. It's complete.
It's a syntactical adrenal gland.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's just weeping emphasis, right? To the point where you're worn out from being so emphatic. But you're right. I hear this. Absolutely is a way of supersizing yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so I've been thinking about this
Yeah.
in the context of is it something that I haven't noticed, but that has come to my attention in the last while because of I think the undercurrent of fear and uncertainty that I don't think I'm immune to, even though I don't go out much. But given the times we're in, and every time you look into the internet or speak to people on the phone, it's just there under the surface, the anxiety and fear of other people, and so beyond my saying yes and any child rearing being wanting to this child's approval, which probably is the case, but or the saying yes is the love of the child, this I know to be true. I was thinking about these times in particular, whether they're even more fraught with the unwillingness to be learning. In your book, Come of Age, in the chapter An Important Safety Announcement, you speak so deeply about the difference between learning and knowing.
Knowing, yeah.
And I remember you. I'm gonna quote. You said, "Learning is all the uncertainty that you can bear." Yeah, and I've been wondering about not just my take to go towards certainty and responding to this child, but whether this is a viral also response of the grasping on, which is not only in these times, to certainty. And in the book you speak of that the lack of having elders, I wonder, is that some of the place where our unwillingness to be learning comes from? You spoke earlier about this younger man in his 40s not having and not even being willing to consider older people. Is it that grasp for knowledge rather than being willing to wonder, is it, I don't hear the question exactly, but is it related, those two, the lack of elders and the unwillingness to learn? Could it be?
Yeah, sure, it could be. You know, if I remember the quote, it's a big if, but I think the quote went something like this: knowledge is all the uncertainty you can bear. Learning is the uncertainty you can't.
Wow.
I think that's what it was. In other words, that's my effort to not drive such a wedge between learning and knowing, even though it sounds like that's what I've been doing over the years, and probably guilty. Probably guilty. But this is some penance. And if I didn't write it that way, I mean that now. That's the revised rendering of that thing. So learning is all the uncertainty of life that you can't bear. This is why it's so expensive and so hard on you. And it's also why it's counterintuitive to do it. So left to our own devices, generally speaking, when your heart is a comfort-seeking missile, knowing and therefore certainty has a tremendous claim upon us. Well, what do we know about this time? Very little. Is there any learning going on? Not inevitably. It seems to me, I made a school, as you know, that's predicated on wondering about the unauthorized history of this thing called America. Not the country or the people, the citizens of that country. I mean the idea. And in there, I suggested that, first of all, it wasn't, everybody didn't come. It was the people who could afford to come came. Wow. Right? So the real casualties stayed. The real casualties of the way of life that people were fleeing in Europe stayed. So this means that the people who came were, comparatively speaking to them, beneficiaries of the thing that they were trying to get away from. Wow. So that colors things, interestingly, doesn't it? Wow. And then the next thing you could think is, did old people come with them? And if they did they survive the Middle Passage? Wow. And I would say, not unlike today, the likelihood is that the older people who tried to make a go of it didn't survive the trip.
Wow.
So people may have set sail in the presence of elders, but may not have landed in their presence.
Wow.
And what they stumbled onto, stony shore with was that the middle-aged people were mysteriously, suddenly, and very in a way that they didn't seek, surrogate elders. There's no such thing, though. There's no such thing as surrogate elders. So now we have people, older people, dying proportionally of this, far in excess of anybody else's mortality rate, right? This may be, without making too much of a myth of the thing, this may be our encounter with the Middle Passage, a kind of modern rendering of you set sail, at the beginning of the year 2020 with your older people safely housed, being cared for by people being paid next to nothing to care for them, having to work in 3 different institutions to be able to do it, which is, we know now, one of the ways that the plague has gone from one of these facilities to another. And within 2 to 3 months, you're finding that the place that you entrusted your old folks to can't be expected to care for them. Wow. And the option of bringing them home is not really available because it's basically forbidden, right? So what a remarkable parallel. What a tragic parallel. Mm-hmm. And to a significant degree, not seeing them again. Wow. Hearing about their death. In the same way that once you left in the old days, right? You would get a letter 4 or 5 months or something, if at all, to find out what had become of the people you left behind. So all of this is to say that if learning were easy, we'd be doing it pretty much as a consequence of rolling out of bed in the morning. Right? Any dangerous and undoing stuff to learn about today, we'd be saying. Any place where my certainty can run be shipwrecked, never to be revived. That's what we would be doing. I wrote this thing a few weeks ago and put it out there. A little meditation about safety. And I said, if there was ever a time where platitudes should be tombstoned, this is one of those times. Stay safe, be safe being the one I took on. And somebody wrote to me in great affront and say, well, when I say safe, I mean, and it went on to elaborate, ameliorate actually, and turn it into a doable. There's nothing doable about being safe. That's it. It's not because I say so. I mean, just investigate it, what it means. So, are you willing to learn that there's no such thing as safety? Or do you insist on being safe and to derive some vague and ultimately false sense of certainty about that, which elevates, as you know, the other question clearly traced, elevates whoever's going to reinstate your sense of personal safety will be your God. I mean,
Wow.
you can't overstate that. That'll be your deity, right? That'll be you'll go to more than once. But the real deity, of course, is uncertainty.
Wow.
That's the one that we deserve. And the beautiful thing about having older people, I mean, accomplished older people, I should say, you know, deeply initiated into their lives older people, is that they're so bad at so many things by that time in their lives, right? They're so easily undone, but not unnerved by that undoing, right? As their physical capacities wane and so on like this. That's what I mean by undoing. But they're not, their nerve mysteriously acquires a kind of resolve capacity that they didn't have when they were functioning and firing on all cylinders. But when they're not, the understanding that this is what's becoming of you turns out to serve you very well indeed. Because compared to that, nothing that anybody can sling at you holds a candle to the way you're being undone by the time parade coming to your house and inviting you to dance. Right? So the beautiful thing about watching older people be owned, the good ones, the skilled ones, is that they, very occasionally, they'll just look at you, see if you're paying attention. And as they are with very young people, no instruction. All of this happens by example. You're either watching or you're not. But if you segregate them, as we do, it doesn't matter if you're watching or not, they're out of view. See? And their capacity to be old is lost on you.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Well, we've gone a while, and people tell me that the general attention span is challenged after. Again, we've probably gone beyond the statute of limitations on it, but maybe people can, those of 17 who are hanging in there, give us just another couple of minutes, and maybe there's one more question. We'll see if we can take care of it.
My question has to do with farming and God and the ground.
Great way to
in
end.
the sense of the Christian God. I've been imagining that there are a lot of people, perhaps still in these times of lockdown, in their apartments in the cities, and I've been wondering whether they have started lamenting the way they have chosen to live so away from the ground, and whether they have started longing to grow some food. And in these days that I've been here, I have farmed the most, I suppose, in my days. And while tending to the ground, I started paying attention to the position of being bent on my knees and my positioning, actually looking down. And I was wondering whether, in your opinion, there's an actual intelligence to the fact of that the position that is required while working the ground is to be in a devotional way, in a way to praise the ground, as if the gods live in the ground. And the other fold of the question was that coming from Italy, there's a lot of old prejudices to the people, to farmers and people that,
Against farmers, you mean?
like farmers, like peasants.
Yes.
And it's an old prejudice.
Yeah.
Like if your family was farmers, you're looked down upon,
Right.
and something that you only did because it was the only thing you could afford. And it's still part of the modern days. And that's a country very heavily affected by Catholicism and Christianity, where there's instead this think of looking up and looking at God that's high up and removed from the ground. And so the question was whether there's this aversion that the modern people have towards the ground or farming, and still carries any of that in it.
Well, the first thing is, early on in your observation, you wondered whether urban people are regretting their decision to live, quote, far away from the ground. So the first thing I'd like to acknowledge is the likelihood that it was never decided by the lion's share of those people. They never had that decision to have to make. Like the option was probably never there, right? And in all fairness, they continued what was laid open for them to continue, right? And nobody can farm in the Western world who's not a millionaire several times over. You can't enter into it if you're not a millionaire. Which is to say, the expense, basically it's land expense, right? And the closer you are to a city, which is the only way for a farmer to basically survive, is to be close to the market for his or her produce or what have you. The higher the land prices and the more undoable it becomes. You have to go into extraordinary levels of debt to push soil around, right? It's an indefensible decision to make from the point of view of financial responsibility and so on. And probably most people have never even thought to do it. That's the first thing. Second thing is, when you assume the position that you described, you can be cursing every minute of it. As no doubt a good number of people in your country and other places have done over the centuries. There was a remarkable scene in a play written by Bertolt Brecht called The Life of Galileo. And in it, Galileo's under house arrest. I think most of us are generally familiar with the thing. And the powers that be, the ecclesiastical powers that be, have got him under house arrest because he's toying with the idea that the earth is not the center of the universe, and he thinks he's seen proof, and he's just inviting the powers that be to look, and they won't look. And so in the play, there's a moment when the equivalent of the Grand Inquisitor, the bishop or whatever, comes to visit Galileo in his tower. And it's a daytime. And there's a window, something like this. And they're looking out the window in idle conversation, two intelligent men, okay, who don't have personal animosity, understanding that they're caught up into larger forces, and in a different circumstance, they might have well have been allies or friends. But anyway, this is what's happened. And out the window, the peasants are working the fields, bent over in exactly the position that you mentioned. And the inquisitor says to Galileo, listen, I'm not sure that he acknowledges that he's right, but he says, if you are right, if we are not the center of the universe, if instead we are whirling on a bit of rock, pointlessly, meaninglessly, and so on. He points to the peasants in the field. He said, how are we to keep them working in the field? Then he just leaves it like that. It's an amazing moment because, and Marxists will say, yeah, of course. The idea being that the opiate of the people is religion, no. And it's keeping them sedated. Well, the presumption of that scenario, the sedation that requires people, that enables people to work the field, comes from an understanding that it's a degraded way of life. Right? So the critique already has a degradation in it. Right?
Wow.
Okay. So then come to the present moment. The first thing that occurred to me in the early days of this virus was maybe people will tear up their lawns. Wouldn't that be something? Maybe what they'll do is they'll have a combination of flowers and food, because maybe the challenge to their understanding of whether or not it's guaranteed that the food will continue to come is deep enough to begin to look at the lawn as some kind of apostasy and not a naturally occurring thing at all, but a kind of sterilized something. And I'd still go for that. I'd say, if you have any doubt, then, as John Prine said, God bless him, he's just died of this too. He said, blow up your TV, right? Throw away your papers. Well, dig up your front lawn. Put that in the song. Dig up your front lawn. Why not?
Wow.
But it's really important to say that none of these activities will guarantee that you'll enter into a sense of, well-being, oneness with the ground. No, because it requires an understanding of life to participate in this kind of work and to do so honorably and devotionally. You can assume the position of devotion and it just looks servile.
Wow.
See, they're indistinguishable, these two things. And if you come from a way of life as we do in North America, it's not wild on doing something that doesn't accelerate your progress through life, which farming certainly doesn't do that. I mean, you basically die knowing a bit more than you knew when you got into it, but not necessarily with a lot to show unless you sold. And now you're a millionaire and you're in an old folks home,
Wow.
looking out the window wondering about the virus, sitting on your millions. So obviously it's a choice I made, and I love the choice I made. And but the time between when I made it and now, a lot of things have happened physically that make it less and less possible for me to work the way I once did, although I spent all morning out in the bush today. But people say, well, that's why you're not making any sense. You should have rested. Right? It's just really important, I guess, to my mind, the important thing is to not turn any gesture into a symbol of something. And farming has been symbolized and heroized, if that's a verb, and so on, to its discredit and to our discredit and so on. It's obviously honorable. Maybe it's not so obvious, but it's honorable work, but it can be done horribly. It could be done in a way that defames what's entrusted to you, obviously. I mean, the key is to farm without recourse to debt, because debt will disfigure your relationship to everything you're responsible to, for the ground, the animals, the plants, the seeds, everything. Right? So if you don't inherit a farm, I don't know how young people could get into it. And this is why, frankly, why all of you are here. Because you needed a way of getting to this without millions to get you there. Right? So. Well, I mean, that's just an answer that kind of staggers to no conclusion at all, you know. There's no summing up a time like we're in. There's no, in the interviews, people say to me, was there anything that you want to say? And I said, well, I just said it for an hour. If there's anything you want to leave people with, well, that's what I was thinking the whole time. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think, all kinds of things you haven't asked me that are really important, but I can't think of one of them right now. And that's where a position I sit right now. I mean, the things you wondered about and the questions were tremendous. And maybe the people who are listening, all 17 of them, find their lives somewhere in what you've asked about, or what seemed to be contrary to their lives or hostile to them. I don't know. And, we don't have to be authoritative. And at a time like this begs us to lay down our sense of authority and exchange it for a willingness to be a citizen, an uncertain citizen in a troubled time, and translate your citizenship into something that is mindful of the time to come. Doesn't predict it, doesn't determine it, but at some level we conduct ourselves like there will be such a thing as people. And what will they hear from us about now? So I would just stop with this observation. I found myself to be in a lot of despair in the last few weeks. It took me quite a long time to realize that's what it was. But certainly it's despair, and I've been despairing because I'm afraid that we're going to be okay again. And it's just an awful thing to put into words because I know what it sounds like. So you want people not to be okay. Yes, that's correct. I want people not to be okay. By which I mean our sense of okay is too expensive for the world.
Wow.
Okay, period. And, I've sat on the porch in the middle of the day and I've listened. I've tried to make myself do it many times in the day, and it struck me. This is 100-year-old quiet I'm hearing. This place, even out here in the country, hasn't been quiet like this in 100 years.
Wow.
Right? And what did it take? A plague. And what would be the undoing of this quiet? The all-clear whistle. And I'm very forlorn, frankly, at the prospect of it. As this is all dispelled and people, quote, get on with their lives. If I could wish anything upon anybody, ourselves included, is that we take dictation from the great beyond on this one. And we say, we all didn't die after all. We get some kind of umpteenth chance to take the measure of our way of life and decide, while there's still a decision to make, to live with less, to understand our kids are entitled to less than we had when we were their age, and to love the world and to love our lives by pulling back. And I'm afraid none of that's going to happen. And that's the way I'd like to leave this for now.
Wow.
Beautiful wandering.
Thank you.